If you have ever wondered where organic food comes from and what type of farms it's grown on, then our next guest is just the right person to provide answers to that and many more questions. Owen Hablutzel has amassed a huge amount of experience through working internationally on virtually every continent, including countries like Mexico, Turkey, Canada, Africa, and probably in a farm, ranch, classroom or institute near you. Owen specialises in helping farmers and ranchers develop a workable whole system or holistic management approach to producing food that makes the farm work more efficiently and more productively, not by taming the land, but through helping farmers work with the land and so make the best use of the natural resources that are already there. Owen is a certified educationalist with the Holistic Management Institute International, and frankly that shines through in our conversation as he explains how those who work with the land can produce more food for less cost, while at the same time ensuring that the land remains healthy for future generations to come. So let's join Owen and Alain now and find out where the best organic food comes from.
Good morning, Owen, and welcome to the Low Carb Paleo Show.
Good morning. Good morning. Thank you for having me here.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure to have you on. And hello, Mark. How are you?
Wonderful. Thank you, Alain. Wonderful. I take it you're having a brilliant day as well?
Brilliant, I don't know, but yeah, it's pretty shiny. Pretty shiny. Well, Owen, we heard about you from Chris Custon from the Savory Institute.
Right,
we learned a lot from him, but I'd like to hear more from the kind of work you're doing. It's quite a recommendation, and thank you again for being on our show. Can you give us a little background about yourself?
Well, I grew up in California in the San Joaquin Valley. So San Joaquin Valley, if you don't already know, or your listeners, it's a very, very agriculturally dense part of the world. I think it is the most agriculturally dense part of the world. And so that was a constant background where I grew up, although I wasn't on a farm or a ranch specifically, although I spent a lot of time on them, with different friends I had and that kind of a thing. But that was everywhere, right? So like a fish in water, you don't really notice the background so much. And so I wasn't necessarily focused there, but I had a series of jobs that were related to agriculture in one way or the other, because that's mostly what you could do growing up in that area. So be it landscaping or working with nurseries, or I worked for the Department of Food and Agriculture in California for a period of time, mostly doing training for different sorts of, peach inspectors and wine grapes and olives and a lot of different products that come out of California. So my path, I suppose, into all this was a bit zigzag, you might say, kind of a non-linear, sort of wasn't a direct route. And like life often is, right? Unless you just know from the time you're 5 that you want to be a lawyer, and then you take your classes and you become a lawyer. I mean, I suppose there's a linear path too, but this one was not that way. I went and I lived in Zimbabwe for a year, just after having done a year of college at Turkey Tech, Stanislaus State University in California. And so in Zimbabwe, I was living on a ranch. It was a 175,000 acre place. It was, just pretty much all entirely bushland. There was maybe 200 acres that were in some cropping, but so mostly there I was learning game management. It was managed as a wildlife ranch. They did photographic safaris and this kind of a thing. So, but actually I had no clue what I was doing for the most part. I was just learning how to do tracking and running around in the bush. That's kind of what I was up to. I came back to the U.S. after that, and I wound up going to film school.
All right.
And that's how I originally wound up in Southern California. So I went to USC, and got out of that, had to figure out how to pay for it, and so went to work in the film industry, more or less doing light sculpting. So that was kind of the job description, So in any case, it didn't take too long to figure out I didn't want to do that entirely for a living. and but I wasn't sure what I did want to do.
Hmm.
And so somewhere in there too, I then went back to school, partly to get out of doing all the film work. And I went and lived in New Mexico, and I went to a college called St. John's College, and so my graduate master's was in Eastern philosophy, in essence. And so that was another little
Yeah.
zigzag in the path. But I think that really has helped me a lot to do what I'm doing now. And what I'm doing now is I do consulting, I do education, teach workshops, independent workshops, and I do group facilitation for groups managing land. And so very broadly, all of this is based in what you would probably just call sustainable agriculture or regenerative agriculture. That's kind of the broad field. And so how I first got into that track then was sort of, while I was still working in the film industry, coming across something called permaculture, which I'm sure we're going to talk a little bit more about in our conversation. And it's at first I just thought it was some kind of raised bed gardening technique or something like this, and I just kind of set it aside. So maybe I'll check that out at some point. And but then it kept popping up here and there, and so I started to dig a little bit more into it and realized there's a lot more going on than just gardens in permaculture. It's a very sort of holistic framework for this kind of stuff. So I got very intrigued. Just started really digging into it. I went to Australia. I took a permaculture design certificate course from Bill Mollison, who's one of the originators of the concept, and Jeff Lawton, who's one of the prominent kind of proponents of this today. And ended up going back to Australia again to do interning and just more of a learning journey. And so I went for several years on what I call kind of a nomadic free-range university, where I would just find workshops that were related to what I was trying to do and go take them. I'd take time off work to just go do that. And while I was at work, I was doing huge amounts of reading. I would be able to get through, that was the one benefit of that job. I could kind of get paid to do research. I would get through two books a week usually doing that job. Kind of tells you how long we were there every day. But in any case, that it was really valuable, and I just had made a career transition in essence to what I'm doing now over many, many years. And so I've been doing this full time now for 3 years, and of course I've been doing it part time, progressively more and more for many years prior to that. So anyhow, it's a bit of a long story, but that's kind of how I got here.
Cool. Can you tell us what permaculture is?
Well, I mean, at its sort of basic essence, permaculture, like the word comes from a contraction of permanent and agriculture, or permanent culture. So it's just this idea of kind of linking and connecting humans and our environment, in a responsible way, a way that's capable of permanence out into the future, and that provides us with everything that we need at the same time. So you could also think of it as kind of an applied science of ecological design. So we're kind of looking at the patterns of nature and trying to design systems that produce food and fiber and human needs through mimicking the patterns of nature, through working with the force of nature, rather than working against it. And I think that's really the basic difference between permaculture and regular agriculture as we know it today. And the way it's practiced today is very much working against nature and against the natural systems, what natural systems are trying to do. They're trying to make kill everything that wants to live and and try to grow things that want to die in those environments, oftentimes. So that's kind of the basic difference. But it's a kind of a holistic framework that integrates land and resources and people through just mutually beneficial synergies is what you're really trying to build with a permaculture system. And it really is applicable to many different scales, from just your backyard or your home to the city to the whole landscape. It's applicable at many scales.
So this is the sort of thing that you could have on your rooftop then, if you were living in an apartment or something.
Absolutely, your rooftop could be designed in a permaculture way, and to fit into that specific context where you live.
I was actually that tells you how much we are on the same page. I was going to ask you the same question.
Oh, fantastic. So, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things in the permaculture toolbox. So, I mean, it's not just agriculture, but, energy systems, natural building,
Hmm.
forestry, waste management, animals, aquaculture, various forms of appropriate technology, economics and community development, so social pieces come into it as
Hmm.
well. So it's a pretty interesting. Almost anything you're interested in, you can find a way to apply it through a permaculture lens.
You seem to being applying different systems, and I'm curious about another one, which is
Hmm,
I read that you worked with Pacific Organics Farm and
sure.
teaching them key lime design. What is key lime design? Key
Well, key
lime.
line, yeah, key line. So yeah, some people hear key lime like the pie, right? But
Right,
it's
right, right.
Hmm. Sounds
but
tasty.
rather line with an N rather than an M, right? Line like drawing a line.
Right.
Uh, and yeah, so like permaculture, that actually comes out of Australia, and in essence, if you kind of look where permaculture originated, these guys were Bill Mollison and David Holmgren, who originated those ideas, were hugely influenced by a man called P.A. Yeomans, who was basically a mining engineer who got into agriculture later in life in Australia after World War II.
Hmm.
They were suffering from a massive drought at that time across pretty much all of Australia. And what happened to Mr. Yeomans, he had bought two very large properties to just try his hand at agriculture after learning a lot about earthworks and mining engineering, geology. He had all that in his background, and so he understand how to move water around
Hmm.
landscapes because they do that for mining a lot,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
He got in with his brother-in-law into this agriculture as this new venture right in the middle of this super intense drought. And as it turned out, there's a huge fire that went across the farm, one of the farms that they purchased. They had two, and it actually killed his brother-in-law. This
Oh, really?
fire, not as well as his favorite horse. So he lost a huge amount in as a result of this drought, really.
Hmm.
Um, and so, kind of as a response to that, I think to me it seemed like the rest of his life was a response to that event, and he's just this relentless experimentation on the land on how can I make this place um, drought proof was the term that he used. It's not a
Hmm.
term that I use, which we might be talking about drought a little bit later here. I'll explain why I don't talk about things being drought proof, um, but rather drought resilient.
Hmm.
In any case, but yeah, that was his quest: was how can I drought proof properties so that something like this never happens again, to people. This shouldn't happen. And so he came up with also really the first whole farm planning methodology and published this in books, the Keyline Plan, starting in the 1940s and 50s, and he was doing this 15 years of just relentless experimentation. And so this led to this methodology, as well as in particular, he designed a subsoiling plow implement,
All right.
non-inversion
Hmm.
plow implement that does not turn the soil over. And we can talk maybe a little bit more about why that's important. But in any case, so there was many things that go into that package, but without that, these guys who came up with permaculture, I think, would have been flapping in the breeze a little bit more. They really picked up on what Yeomans was doing and just kind of advanced that even much further.
What kind of special equipment are you using?
Oh, so well, one more thing on keyline
Hmm.
design. Yes, it's this whole farm planning methodology, but in particular, I mean, Yeomans was really the first guy to kind of lay out a methodology that was very sensible, where you could lay out an entire farm property or ranch property based on the land shape.
Hmm.
So you fit it right into your climate context, into what's going on with the topography, the actual shape of the land, and how can you design all the other elements, the roads, access, tree systems, cropping systems, fencing, subdivision, grazing, um, and soils and soil building. How can you design that into this big picture plan? And so that's really what he came up with. And so part of the soil building piece then was something that was revolutionary that Yeomans recognized. I mean, literally, if you go to even today into a university course on soils, they're going to tell you it takes 1,000 years to build 1 inch of topsoil.
Yeah, yeah. Tell the
Well,
chickens.
Yeomans just blew this out of the water, this idea. He showed that you could build inches of topsoil very, very rapidly, even within years. Um, and there are some folks out there who have used some of these processes who, make claims of even building 8 inches of topsoil in 1 year. Now, not exclusively using this yeoman's plow, but integrating grazing and biological stimulants and a variety of things. But in any case, it can be very, very powerful. And of course, soil is our most important resource when it comes down to it. Without that, we have nothing. No civilization can exist without it, right? So in any case, the implement that yeomans came up with was called the yeoman's plow or the keyline plow. And it's not a plow like we usually think of plows. It's also referred to as a non-inversion tillage implement. So the idea is you're not turning over the layers, because soils are built of different layers or horizons. You're not turning those over and mixing them together like is done with a normal sort of moldboard agricultural plow. So you're not doing this. And why is that a benefit? Well, that's a benefit because the life in the soil is really what creates topsoil. It's that all those interactions and activities of the soil microbiology, or the soil food web, as it's sometimes called, that are actually the processes that create new living soil. And so you can imagine, if all these things many of them are very microscopic: bacteria, fungi, protozoa, nematodes. So all of these things are very tiny. And so they're adapted to specific niches in the soil profile. And if you were to take, one that lives 6 inches down and expose them to sunlight, or turn them upside down into the wind, it's over for those things, right? It'd be like taking us and it's just chucking us out to Mars or something. All of a sudden, we're probably not going to make it.
No.
Right. So that's a process that turning over the soil kills that soil life or greatly reduces their impact. And so his idea was to basically create this implement that would not turn over the soil, and that would also create conditions for soil life to just explode. And so that would build and constantly create new topsoil. And those conditions are basically, those organisms need oxygen. So a lot of times these soils get very compacted, very tight, and so there's no breathing room literally for them. There's no gas exchange with the atmosphere that needs to be happening to build that soil. So this plow would kind of break that compaction, and fluff up that soil to create a lot of interchange with the atmosphere. And the other thing was he would do it on a specific pattern that honored the land shape, the actual shape of that landform that you're using this implement on. And so it'd be close to what you might call contour plowing, but it is slightly different, in a little bit of a subtle way. But what it ends up doing is it spreads out any water or rainfall that you get as evenly as possible across the landscape. And so basically that moisture is the other thing those critters need.
That brought what might sound as like a silly question, but if you equate earth and soil to our intestinal flora, is it possible to reseed the soil with beneficial bacteria and all these characters that makes it rich into the soil to bring it back to life, even though it's been overused and overworked over traditional agriculture methods?
Absolutely. Well, as I'm sure you're aware, the gut microbiome that we all carry with us in one form or another is hugely important, right? We're learning more and more about this, particularly in the paleo world in general, right? That's been a hot topic more recently because we're really at the tip of the iceberg of kind of understanding what's going on there. But one thing we do already know very well is that many of those beneficial gut bugs for us are soil-based organisms. They're organisms that originated in soils, right? And of course, this would make sense. And it's the same is true for cattle, for animals and this kind of thing. But this would make a lot of sense because we're, the last 2-3 million years of our development, our ancestral development, we were eating so many things right out of the ground all of the time that was just kind of a regular coevolution or adaptation, right? So as to whether you can specifically create and sort of fill soils with those organisms, I haven't seen any specific research on that. My guess would be that, the healthier your soils get, the more of those organisms are just going to naturally be there. We might not even have to try to stimulate that in any specific way. But there are different ways to do biological stimulation of soils, such as compost teas or just directly applying compost on soils, because this compost will contain, and you can actually build compost to contain more or less of certain classes of organisms, fungi, bacteria, and create, that's the important ratios really is between fungi and bacteria as to what else are you going to grow in your soils. Different plants are adapted to different microbiology in the soils, so they'll grow better or worse depending on what critters are there.
So in effect, you actually answered my question. Composting would be the way to revive a soil that has been depleted.
Absolutely, that would accelerate the process for sure. And you could take it in a specific direction. If you wanted to make sure more fungi were getting into that soil, you could do that. If you wanted certain more classes of bacteria, you could do that.
Applying that technique to the conditions that are currently happening in California and Texas, being the drought, how would these techniques help with overcoming the drought?
And so this is where we get to that idea of what's drought-proof versus drought-resilient, because Yeomans was using this drought-proof language. And some people out there were still using this language. I feel like after having looked a little bit more into drought and historically what that is, we have tree ring records in the Southwest U.S. going back 21 centuries that show there are fairly commonly 50, 60-year-long mega droughts in the tree ring record. There is a drought there that was about 200 years long as well, with maybe a little 20-year respite of some higher rainfall somewhere in there, but generally 200 years of drought. And so in the face of something like that, which we don't know whether what we're going into today is one of those or not. There's no way to predict that, obviously. We do know that with what's going on with our climate right now, that any normal drought effects are just going to be exacerbated. They're just going to be made even poorer outcomes than we would get normally. So so in the face of that, I don't think anybody's going to be drought proof. But we can be more or less resilient to the drought. We can be more or less, able to still maintain the functions that we need to maintain ourselves in a drought. So that's that distinction. How can this stuff be applied to drought? Well, the example of the yeoman's plow on keyline pattern cultivation, which is that pattern that honors the landform, that will take any water that we do get, any rainfall that we do get, and store it right in the soil, right where it falls, instead of allowing it to run off the landscape. And so it's going to make the most effective use of the water that we do get. And so we tend to use that not as a silver bullet, but I like to say silver buckshot. Yes, the yeoman's plow is one tool, but there's many, many other tools that need to come into play, to give us the best chance for improving the resilience. And some of those tools could be grazing, which I'm sure Chris Kirsten talked about to some extent, and using a holistic management form of planned grazing. And so in that case, your technical tool is an electric fence oftentimes, right? That's the tool you're using, as well as sort of human creativity and planning, to be able to move those animals around the landscape in a way that also will increase the infiltration of the rainfall, because you are increasing the cover of the soil. It's really the bare ground that is running off the water, that tends to get compacted very easily, where the life can't survive because it's much more extreme than covered soil.
You also work with holistic management. Is that similar to what the Savory Institute works on?
Absolutely, it's precisely the same thing that the Savory Institute is promoting, and so I'm a certified educator for holistic management, and there's two different groups in the world that are currently promoting this practice. One is the Savory Institute, and the other is called Holistic Management International, and they're both doing really good work in the world, and they're both promoting this same framework, which is more or less also this holistic way to look at agriculture. But holistic management also would include, even if you're not involved in agriculture, what it comes down to is improving your decision making on a day-to-day basis, and taking you towards the things that you do want in life instead of away from the things that you don't want. We find that that's a much more effective way to achieve visions and goals often. Responding to the actual context that you live in to make better decisions in life. And they have some techniques that are specifically applicable to agriculture, like grazing planning. So if you don't have animals, you don't use the grazing planning maybe, but there's plenty of other parts of holistic management that you could use.
Yeah.
Financial planning, so there's a lot of elements to it.
Very interesting. How does all of these methods and techniques relate to the low carb and paleo lifestyle?
Is related in many, many ways, as you can imagine, because also the low carb paleo lifestyle, is part of that broader sort of ancestral health kind of approach or viewpoint on the world, which I think is also a very holistic one, you might say, because we're taking elements of many different things. Food, of course, is a huge one, but exercise, anthropology, paleontology. So, I mean, you name it, of a discipline, and there's probably some way that it's fitting in to this framework. And so this is true also for using these different sustainable or regenerative agriculture approaches: permaculture, keyline, holistic management, and there are others, agroecology, various forms of agroforestry, or silvopastoralism, which is just kind of using trees and grass and animals and in a single system. All of these things are about producing food, but not only about producing food. They're certainly producing healthy food, but at the same time that you're producing food, you're producing soil. And not just soil, but healthy ecosystems, which to me is very exciting, because this is much more the bigger picture of what low carbon paleo ideas are about. It's about health, but health does not stop at the individual organism, or cannot stop at the individual organism, right? Because no organism is separate from its environment. So in that sense, ecology is destiny. It's if we're going to have a future, we need to be building the kind of ecology that humans need to thrive, that humans need to be healthy. And the amazing thing, and the very exciting thing, is that we can use the way that we both create and interact with our food systems to create those very ecologies. And so if you look, at kind of where humans evolved, what kind of landscapes humans evolved in? We evolved in savanna landscapes in Africa, right? So if you go back 5-6 million years from now, the Earth as a whole was undergoing a significant drought.
Yeah.
And so basically we had forests retreating. Forests were getting smaller and smaller, actually all over the world, but certainly in Africa. And this meant that dry lands were increasing, And so the forest basically thinned out to create these savanna landscapes. And by savanna, I'm just talking about basically grasslands with scattered trees. So it's kind of a thinner forest, if you will, but with a lot of grass. And these are actually the habitats that support more mammal biomass than any other biome on the planet,
Right.
which I think has a lot to do with why humans evolved the kinds of intelligences that we did. Is there were so many other animals out there, so many other players on the scene that we had to figure out how to contend with. That once we came out of the trees and out into the open, it was a whole new game out there. Um, and so this affected everything about what is beneficial in the long term for human ecology, because like we talk about often in paleo, that's where our genetics evolved. And so it's actually not only those foods that our genome expects, but it's those landscapes that our genome expects. And this is backed up in many studies as well. So if you can look at studies cross-culturally, universally, doesn't matter where you grew up, if you grew up in the Amazon or if you grew up in the Arctic, when they, on average, when they give people pictures of landscapes, their favorite ones are savannas across the world, across cultures. This is true. And it's easy to see. You go anywhere in the world and go to a golf course. What does that look like? Go to a park. What does that look like?
Yeah, I
Right?
see where you're coming from, yeah.
And even, that's even where we want to go back to when we die. Go to the nearest cemetery, and it probably is a savanna.
Yeah.
Maybe in the States, possibly, yes.
We still have space for that, but in Europe, where space is tighter, it's more of a
It's a multi-story
it's a
cemetery.
Okay.
yeah,
I
multi-story.
gotcha.
They burn your body and they stick your ashes into a little slot
Uh-huh.
inside of what is basically a concrete, you know, mortuary,
Okay, sure.
which is kind of weird. Um,
Yeah, and they're
So
always
there's no trees?
very few.
well,
The older cemeteries have in sort of the
Yeah.
outer lying villages, but again, it depends on the terrain. If they've got a lot of
Of
land
course.
around them,
Yeah.
then they'll have a big cemetery. If they haven't, then it's sort of built up and up and up.
Fair
in
enough.
my hometown, for example, in Nice, which is basically extremely limited space-wise because the mountains are right there, the cemetery is literally running out of room. So what they've done is build these concrete. In French we have this term. It's called HLM. I don't know what you would call that in English, Mark.
Council housing, social
Some
housing.
Right, social housing is basically you pile up people in little box called apartment. Well, when you die, you go from the little box called apartment into the little box called cemetery. So, so the dream of being buried in the savannah as in big cities is probably not quite there.
Sure.
Um,
In the big cities in the U.S., we still have them, at least in many, many cemeteries.
Yeah, yeah.
right,
But
right.
yeah, I guess when you have that much history and that many people having, died over or thousands of years in one landscape, then it starts to get more difficult space-wise.
Hmm.
Right.
Um,
Can I share something personal? I told my
sure.
son that when I die, I want to be cremated and I want my ashes to be dropped into a hole in the ground and plant a tree on top of it.
Fantastic. There you go. There you go. You've got everything you need there. So you got a tree, just a little bit of grass around it, and you've
Well,
got the savanna there.
well, my ashes could use to feed the tree, and
That's right.
so you could one could argue that my soul would be in the tree, and it would be instead of having a tombstone, the tree would be it. You know, They-
That's
maybe
right.
maybe he can maybe he can carve my name into the tree, so to remember people who I am. But going
Beautiful.
going back going back to business.
Oh,
The,
sure.
the kind of work you do expose you to also so great quality food. Are you also yourself paleo?
Oh, that's right. Well, I haven't necessarily been calling it paleo. Like, I started kind of eating this way The first book I read on this was Nora Gedgaudas. I'm never quite positive how to pronounce it, but her Primal Body, Primal Mind. And so that approach was, maybe a little bit more like Mark Sisson's kind of primal, where, dairy is involved. And also I had been exposed to the Weston Price approach, which I also appreciate a lot. Although I'm very nomadic at this stage in life, and I'm traveling around so much, I don't have so much time to do the kind of food preparation that's required for at least some of the Western Price. But kind of any case, I appreciate all of those ways of eating, and I certainly appreciate paleo. But no, I tend to, focus on fats basically, and that's where I started out with this. That's where I was feeling really, really good once I transferred over into that, which is many, many years ago. And I think 2008 was when I kind of started eating this way, and I realized, look, if I'm going to be making this transition of a career in as short a time as possible, it's going to be about performance. I'm going to be having to perform at my best, but not just physically, but mentally. And kind of the more I looked into it, the more I realized how important fats were to that equation, and brain health, and as well as just how chronically fat deprived most of this country is, at least. I know coming from France, you guys don't have that issue as much as we do, because fats are much more appreciated in the cuisine.
Which is a reason why I never understood this. When I came to this country in '79, it just boggled my mind to see the war against fat that there was in this country, and I never subscribed to that, because in France you put cream and butter and and cheese and everything. So and we are French are known to be healthier in general than Americans. So it never made any sense to me. So when the whole paleo came around, and basically it justified what I've been knowing growing up in it, it's like, okay, finally they're coming to their senses.
Part of the way I also kind of edged into that originally was just from some early clients that I had, and they were, wanted to raise grass-fed beef, and they were starting to do that. So, just looking into the benefits of grass-fed beef versus, factory beef, in essence, or CAFO beef, and how much more healthy that those things were, just started, all that started to really click at the same time. Started to realize how important the food part of it was to right. Not just health, but not just human health, certainly to human health, but ecosystem health, and I think that's maybe one of the next levels where paleo can start to kind of pay more attention to, I think, is how directly our eating habits affect what happens to our ecosystems that we live in. It's the primary bond. Food is the primary bond that we have with our environment. It's that's the information our genome is getting, and we're that's the whole epigenetics piece, right? We're constantly communicating with our genome through what we put in our bodies. And so that's where I think where the paleo has come from, is we're starting to understand ourselves, humans, as what it means to be the human species. What our species actually needs. I think you have to understand to a degree what you are as a species, even before it's meaningful to understand what you are as an individual. If you don't understand kind of the species level at some level first, it's much more difficult to understand what it even means to be an individual. And so, realizing that we can't separate ourselves from our environment, and that all of our activities, that's the one thing everybody does, is eat, right? And if we want to positively affect those habitats, the choice we make of what we eat every day literally is either creating soil or destroying it.
So speaking of which, I'd like to talk about monoculture. What do you think? What's your opinion on that?
Well, monoculture, of course, is the way that almost all of our food is grown in the system, and that applies even to organic food. So, this is something Alain, who came up with holistic management, points out from time to time, is that, organic is a step in the right direction. Certainly, we can't, we do need these toxins out of our food system, but it's at the end of the day, it's not a sustainable agriculture in and of or by itself,
No.
right? It's not a sustainable way to practice by itself because we're still using huge monocultures to, even if it's organic, which have very negative effects. So, like I was talking about, what's the human habitat? The human habitat that we are adapted to is the savanna, right? It's these very complex landscapes. They're some of the most complex on the planet, which is why they support more mammal biomass than any others. And that complexity has to do with the diversity, with many, many different plants growing, with many, many different animals supported, with huge diversity of soil microbiology, birds, you name it, right? Lichens and mosses and insects, and it support huge diversities of all of these things, and that's what makes for this complexity. And the interactions of all of those elements create a very healthy system with a lot of integrity and a lot of resilience. So it can experience a shock or a stress and still recover from that and still provide everything that you need ultimately, even under those kinds of shocks and stresses. Now, it's a totally different situation for monocultures. And it's pretty easy to imagine. If you have, a field of, 1,000 acres of just one single kind of plant, where do you think the insects that like that kind of plant are going to hang out? Right? And so then, now we've got a plague of these insects in this area, so now we've got to spray whatever else, whatever gets sprayed on these things to deal with that, insecticides, obviously, or maybe a fungus can then come and invade. So in other words, because you've made your environment far less diverse, it's the meaning of monoculture, right? It's just a single, plant oftentimes that's out there. Now you've exposed yourself to every pest or, drought condition that it doesn't do well in, or, whatever environmental parameter or variable that is going to degrade that plant's ability to reproduce and to produce well. You're going to kill off everything at once instead of, having a variety of other things that might do well, even if that plant is not doing it.
Plus, again, I'm not a farmer, but my understanding is that when you're doing that, you also weakens the plant itself because it's not depending on itself to defend itself against its natural bugs and otherwise it basically relies on the pesticides to do a job for them. So they tend to progressively weaken and have to be constantly strengthened by all additional chemicals to grow in, which is why the content, the vitamin, minerals, and all that, natural compounds of plants are not the same from monoculture than they are from either organic or sustainable food, right?
I think that's right, and the soils just continue to get more and more depleted over time. And when they're grown in these monocultures, that pretty much means you're turning over the soil every year. You're doing that thing we were talking about where you're killing the life in the soil year after year after year after year, just by plowing, not even to mention, all the biocides of many different forms that you're putting on there. And so it leads to a lot of problems, and it's a big problem in our culture generally of only thinking about efficiency. We have to get this more efficient, more efficient, more efficient. And efficiency is in many ways in direct opposition to this idea I've been talking about of resilience. So there is a whole academic, and scientific literature around resilience that's mostly emerged in the last 10 years, even in a special way. But I think the first paper on it came out in the 70s. But it's only gotten very popular more recently, and it is the cutting edge of sustainability science. And so what a lot of the farmers and ranchers I work with, we're aiming to have basically efficiency it's not that we're not considering efficiency, we're considering that, but we consider resilience to be probably about twice as important. And this is true for ecosystems as well. It's twice as important as efficiency if you're going to have a system that can continue to function indefinitely in your current context. And the other thing with doing that plowing to put in your monocultures is, you're using fossil fuels, and so you're contributing CO2 to the atmosphere with the tractor, And most people think about that part. What they're not realizing, a tractor is really only 20% of the carbon emissions to the atmosphere from using that type of plowing. The rest of it is actually, you're oxidizing the carbon that's in the soil by turning it over. That gets exposed to air, oxidizes out to the atmosphere. That's really where huge amounts of the carbon, the extra carbon that's currently in the atmosphere has come from, is from agriculture. And
plus, some of the fertilizer they use now are coming from petrol, right? They're chemical fertilizer.
That's right.
They're not natural fertilizer, so that probably contributes as well, right?
Contributes a huge amount, yeah. So it's the artificial nitrogen in essence that they're creating on a huge scale, and none of this stuff is necessary. Like there are plants that will in symbiosis with bacteria will put nitrogen in your soils. Legumes, there are we know them as, right? These plants will put nitrogen into the soils. Your soil food web, your microorganisms in the soil, they will also create plant available nitrogen, but you have to have them there. If you've killed them all, they're not going to be doing that work for you. But for example, a protozoa, which is a predator in the soil food web ecosystem, eats bacteria, and it needs I don't know the precise numbers, but let's say it needs to eat 10 bacteria a day to have its metabolism function properly. Well, each of those bacteria's bodies is made up of nitrogen in part, but this protozoa doesn't need all of that nitrogen for its own metabolism. So what it doesn't need, it basically poops out as waste, which is in a plant available form. So if you have that whole system functioning for you, these plants can have the exact minerals they need exactly when they need them, because they've co-evolved with that entire soil food web to have those exchange relationships in their root zone. And that's what's going to give those plants the minerals they need, and then us the minerals that we need from those plants, and animals for that matter too, that eat the plants that we then eat.
Right. So that leads me to my next question, which is with monoculture invading more and more of the growing soil in this country, how do you see the future of agriculture in a few years?
Yes, if monoculture continues to advance, there is no future. And that's just not a future of agriculture. That's just the future of humans. That's my opinion. So I think this ship has to turn around in the next 10 to 20 years. We're not messing about here. Extinction is actually on the table. So I don't say this as any kind of a doom and gloom kind of prophecy or anything like this. It's just kind of the bare facts of the situation. And the reason it's not doom and gloom is because we're just pointing out, look, these are the bare facts, and so that we can do something about them. It's just like agriculture, I think, is creating the way we're doing agriculture, monocultures and so on, is creating most of the ecological and therefore social issues that we're dealing with today globally. So it's the biggest, in a sense, it's the biggest problem that we have. But I think that also puts in a very, very powerful position to be the biggest solution. Because all we have to do is shift our approach to that, shift it to that, the food, every piece of food we're eating is creating soil, is creating habitat, is building that human habitat that we're talking about, and that can turn the whole situation around. We can literally, by building soils, be pulling that carbon back out of the atmosphere, putting it into the ground. It only takes a 1% increase of organic matter in our soils to basically get us, on a pretty large area, to get us down to, that whole carbon legacy that's out in the atmosphere, to pull that back down into the ground, and in the process just create much healthier plants, much healthier ecosystems. So the future of agriculture I see is perennial agriculture. Agriculture is based on perennial plants, and the difference, of course, between perennial and annual plants is that annual plants they live for a year. Mostly grains, right, is a great example of annual plants. So they sort of require that constant tillage of the soil, that overall killing of the soil to be grown, at least the way that we're doing it now. If we shift to perennial-based agriculture, these are plants that live for a long, long time. You don't have to continually be turning the ground over every year. So that's like trees are perennials, shrubs are perennials, but grasses, many grasses are perennials also. So we can have all the different plants that we want. There's even work going on in trying to make perennial grains. We could have, anybody could have whatever they want to eat, but it would be based on perennial plants, on having constant soil cover, soil perpetually building, and systems that mimic these savannas, but we're using species that produce food, fiber, timber, everything that we need as humans in the savanna,
Right.
in the habitat we need. And we could do it all just through eating the foods that are grown that way.
On the positive side, through this show and through a lot of articles that I read, I'm seeing a shift. A lot of people are starting to realize the disaster we're going through. So, people like you, Chris Kirsten or Joe Salatin, or many young farmers are starting to realize that if we want to survive, and because there's a market as well, because the customers demand now more healthy food, they realize they've been poisoned. Then we, it's the silver lining of this horrible situation currently between monoculture and GMOs and all that, is that people are starting to realize corporations have been poisoning us, and we need to eat something healthier, which creates a demand, which makes younger farmers realize, well, there's a way to make a living without poisoning the planet. So can you, can you expand on that?
Sure, and I agree with you. I think this is this whole movement, if you want to call it that, is definitely growing every day. This movement towards people taking better a hold or control of the food that they're eating, of their own lives, their own health. And things like what you guys are doing, and the whole kind of ancestral health sphere I think are really helping advance that. And then alternatively, on the more agriculturally focused side, it's things like permaculture and holistic management are also really getting more and more well known, and there's more and more people coming into that approach and starting to use it. And so I mean, I've got clients all over the country and in some other countries who are using these approaches and having very good outcomes from them. And not only does it improve the food quality and your ecosystem quality, but just your basic quality of life for humans, which stands to reason, Yeah. And so that's one of the really exciting things, is we can, just by our habits, we can create the habitat that we need, right? So
right.
habitat, in effect, is just the outcome of habits of the organisms that live in it.
If you think about it, we, the customers, basically have the numbers to shift, the paradigm from industrial food production to more localized, healthier, either plants or even meat, grass-fed meat and so on and so forth. So yes. It's also part of our show's mission, is to let people know that there are healthier alternative to the typical brainwashing we get every day from ads and so on and so forth from the big corporations and from governments, that there is a healthier way to go about it, and we should pay attention to that. So I think what you do is extremely important, and you're part of a chain of different people trying to change the system to a healthier system.
I think what you guys are doing is also part of that, and extremely important, and that everybody literally has a role to play, because everybody eats, and it's pretty simple when you look at it in that sense. It's like you can eat food that's building habitat, building soil, or not, right? That's right. At the end of the day. And of course, it might not be super simple overnight to have everything you put in your mouth be, that it's coming from a soil building place, because there's not enough of these farms out there yet. But there are increasing, and they're not that hard to find in the end. And so people are actively seeking these out, and more farmers are starting to go this way. So I'm designing and helping to install more and more of these sort of perennial-based systems where we're using trees, we're using grass, we're using animals, and not only cattle, but many species, because again, it's that diversity. The more diversity of those animals you have in that system, they're all eating from different parts of the plant profile, so they're stimulating a whole diversity of things in that environment, which then becomes a more diverse grassland base or a more diverse perennial plant base as a basis of their behavior.
I want to thank you and people like you that are trying to change the system for a better way of doing things. Going back on the dark side again a little bit, and then we'll try to find a more positive way to end the show. But what's your take? What's your take on GMOs?
Well, genetically modified organisms. Yes. Well, again, usually those are associated with monocultures, right? Because they're sort of designed for that situation. They're designed for a monoculture situation. So what they're doing is reducing the complexity of our world. They're creating a more simple world in which we're going to have, I think that manifests even in much more simple thinking in human beings. If it's true that our intelligence emerged in part because of the vast diversity of our habitats and having to kind of deal and contend with that, then reducing our habitat as simple as possible to these genetically modified organisms in monocultures is going to be reducing our mental capacity in a like fashion, not only from the ill effects of eating them, but just from the ill effects of existing in that type of environment. You can't separate the animal from the environment. And so when we change our environments and make them more simple, we're making ourselves more simple at the same time, and not in a good way. Right. Because we're going to need, to have the types of innovation and the types of human creativity that's going to be needed to, get us to the end of this century. Even it's going to require some peak performance from humans, and so we need to create an environment for ourselves that's going to foster that, that's going to help us achieve that. So in that sense, in the monoculture sense, obviously, I'm not a fan of genetically modified organisms, and obviously, most of the reasons those things are created is purely for profits for the companies creating them, because then you have to buy their products to further support using their genetically modified organisms. And the other thing, hands down, we don't need them.
The consequences of that is because it's all basically profit oriented. Mm-hmm. You see a couple of other things which you are, I'm sure, fully aware of. Is the fact that nature always finds a way to survive. So you have these crops that are created to resist certain bugs or to resist certain pesticides, so they survive being sprayed and oversprayed. But on the other hand, you have superbugs and superweed now evolving, and which forces the farmer to spray even more toxic pesticides on our food, which ends up in our tummy.
That's right, because basically they're using a reductionist, mechanical, linear mindset to try to control nature, which is nonlinear, complex, not predictable, and can advance far faster than your research laboratory can. No matter if you're Monsanto or whoever you might be, and can throw millions of dollars at it, you're not going to keep up with natural ecosystems, complex adaptive systems that can adapt to anything you throw at it. So yeah, these things shouldn't even be called herbicides. They should be called superweed creators. Right? Because that's in effect what they're doing. And the same with, any pesticides. They're super bug creators. That's the effect of what they do. You're basically selecting out the strongest, organisms that are going to resist that toxin, right? And so you're creating super bugs. So it's silly. It's not necessary. It's taking us in precisely the wrong direction in terms of landscape complexity that we need. Food complexity that we need. There are literally thousands of different plants and animals that humans can eat, and insects that humans can eat, but basically we cultivate about 12. 12 to 15 or something of these things, and maybe 8 animals, right, out of thousands and thousands and thousands. And so that's already greatly reduced the diversity of our lives. But now GMOs are essentially reduce that even further down to just these very specific genetic strains of those, 6 or 8 crops or whatever, however many they have modified at this point. It's a horrible idea and totally unnecessary. They've sold that to us as, oh, we have to do it to feed the world. Bullshit.
Yeah.
Can I say that on this show?
You can say it again if you want.
There are many studies out there, right, from the UN and other bodies that show that we can feed the world with agroecological techniques, with smaller scale, non-monoculture. Again, like I started to allude to earlier, it's organic is a step in the right direction, but it's not the end of the story. We have to go beyond that to perennial polycultures. Polyculture meaning many plants are involved and animals. Okay, many plants and animals, perennial polycultures, not organic monocultures. If we're going to lick this thing, if we're going to, I don't know. I don't see a downside to it. I don't see a downside. Maybe if you're a Monsanto executive, you can see a financial downside. But you know what? If your grandkids are going to be alive and eating and thriving on a planet, then that's not a downside.
We need to tell people to invest against Monsanto and all of these, basically sell Monsanto shares instead of buying them, and that will probably send them a message that people don't want their crap on our food.
It's been alluded to sort of several times, but is sort of the key line process totally organic?
Well, I mean, of course, when Yeomans created this, at that time there was something called superphosphate. That was, it was just the beginning of very intensive chemical agriculture right after World War II. Of course, because most of those chemical compounds were, the story of that is like nitrogen. You guys talked about this artificially created nitrogen and so on. That came through something called the Haber-Bosch process, which was actually created around World War I in order to make like mustard gas and a bunch of these warfare applications for those chemicals. And so we got out of the war and we're like, oh, we've got all these factories. And so, hey, guess what? What if we just made war on nature in our agricultural systems and we could keep selling this stuff?
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm sure I'm oversimplifying the story, but that's kind of the general outlines, right? And so Yeomans did use some superphosphate in the first year or two just to get the grass jumping initially, but it was never billed as any necessary part of keyline, and it's still not. And people that are using it are generally not using those types of things. Now, in holistic management, in the decision-making process we don't take any tool off the table. We wouldn't take pesticides off the table or herbicides off the table or nuclear warheads off the table. But what we do is we have a goal, a context, a vision of where we're trying to go, and then a set of questions to ask when we make a decision, kind of filter tests, you might think of them. And by the time you walk through, say you're going to test the decision whether or not to use the pesticide, you look at what is my long-term vision, what am I trying to achieve here? And then you go through each of these tests, and then by the time you get done with that, probably using that pesticide is not going to be a good idea. You're going to realize it, because it's not going to take you to where you're really trying to go. Because instead it's going to create a superbug, and that's not what you're trying to do, right? Or things like that. So it gives you a process to use to think through consistently better decisions. And so if you're even making a better decision 5% of the time, you're going to get towards your vision a lot more quickly. And so that's why, even though, say, GMOs are definitely a profoundly anti-ecological homogenization of our world and landscapes and our humanscapes as well. We might not take it off the table immediately, but we'd run it through the test and say, is this going to get us where we're trying to go? Because we're managing for what we do want instead of managing against what we don't want. And we find that, oftentimes, at least with farmers and ranchers, managing for what you do want is going to get you there. Managing for what you don't want often also achieves what you don't want.
Yeah.
If that makes sense, right? So whichever way you decide to manage for, you end up getting it. if you do it persistently enough. So
Yeah.
if you're managing against weeds all the time, well, somehow you keep getting weeds. Isn't that interesting? Um, I mean, how many, what is it, 125 million or something a year that we spend on eradicating invasive species, plants, and noxious weeds and things like that? And how's that going? How's that price trending? That just keeps going up every year. It's not like we're it's not like we're getting rid of these things, because we're managing for what we don't want and we're achieving it.
But it's good for business, right? It's good for pesticide business. Yeah,
It's great for their bottom line, as far as their financial bottom line. As far as other forms of capital, ecological capital, natural capital, human capital, social capital, it's pretty negative in all those categories. But they're just not accounting for that currently, and that's another part of this picture. We have to start accounting for all the capitals as we're moving forward here, and I think that's what folks like you guys and kind of the ancestral health community in general are really taking a big step towards that. It's like human health is a huge form of capital, and it's inextricable from the ecological health of the landscapes we live in.
Yeah, this negatively orientated management that you're talking about there sort of leads on to the next question that's often thrown back by proponents of using GMOs and modern agricultural systems, is that they're more productive. Now, is that true? Are not the systems that you're putting forward more productive in the long run?
So again, this comes back to, I think, the fundamental paradigm shift that we're moving out of from the last 400 years, this Newtonian sort of reductionist, linear, mathematical sort of physics approach to the world, as opposed to recognizing the inherent complexity, the self-organization processes, the diversity, the unpredictability, the unknowability of what happens in the natural world in many ways. So what do I mean by that? Not to get too far down that track, but I mean, if you say, well, this monoculture system is more productive than your perennial polyculture system, you've already chosen what parameters that you're measuring from the beginning, and that's all you're seeing. You've put on the blinders to look at one variable in a system that is producing almost infinite variables. That's a choice. It's a choice that the scientist makes at the beginning that they don't always acknowledge. Right? They don't sometimes even realize they're doing that. They just see, well, I'm measuring, and how are you measuring that output? So all I'm saying is, in terms of, there's many things we could be measuring, and in terms of, if you're just looking at production of tomatoes per acre, possibly a monoculture is going to be, is going to give you more tomatoes per acre. But what are you losing in soil? What are you losing in, drought resilience? What are you losing in other ecosystem services or natural benefits that nature provides us? Those are actually nutrition. What are you losing in nutrition? What are you losing in ecological structure? What are you losing in biodiversity loss? You've got no more habitat to support any animals or microorganisms, and you've got crappy food. So now you've got a healthcare crisis. There is no healthcare crisis. There's a food crisis. Right? There's an ecosystem crisis. There's right. It's what do we want to measure, and usually those types of claims are only measuring a single variable and from a specific narrow perspective. So you can make any study say about anything that you want.
Normally tons per acre or something, isn't it?
Normally tons per acre. But then, the flip side of that is, even on those types of parameters, these perennial polyculture systems are competitive in many cases. So it's a matter of designing them well and managing them well over time. And that's the other thing. This is a much more exciting. That's why more and more people are starting to get excited about doing farming or ranching, is because these new approaches to it, which actually are incorporating a lot from old approaches.
So they're not new, are they, really? No.
Well, there are new aspects to them. There are, arguably, but there are also definitely, there's a return to some of older approaches that were sensible. But we have a new context we're working in, And we have, new tools, computers and internet for spreading information. Um, you know, the yeoman's plow, the electric fence. The electric fence is an important invention as the wheel for humanity. Joel Salatin makes that claim, and I'll back him up on it because of what it can do to allow ecosystem restoration while providing food, while providing huge amounts of healthy food to boot, as well as pulling that carbon out of the atmosphere in the same stroke.
You're getting me curious about the electric fence. Why is it the new invention, the best invention since the wheel?
Okay, and then the reason is because, of what I mentioned, that we can restore entire habitats, ecologies, healthy landscapes with integrity, using this as a tool for well-managed planned grazing. So that's the reason. So why does that work to help us with well-managed planned grazing? Well, this all comes back to kind of looking at landscapes as wholes, which kind of where holistic management is coming from. The original impulse for holistic management was a book called Holism and Evolution, which might be interesting to ancestral health people in general because that's a evolutionary view. In any case, that book was written in 1926 by a man called Jan Smuts, who was a South African statesman. Holism and Evolution was an important book at the time. Einstein even thought that and claimed that Smuts' holism was going to be basically the new thought for this century, aside from his own relativity. There was going to be two important things. It was going to be relativity and holism. Yeah, Einstein made that claim, and because he read that book in 1926 and was very impressed. Well, basically, what does that say? All it says is nature functions in wholes.
Yeah.
It doesn't function in parts. It functions in wholes. So, a good example is you could bring in scientists, one guy that knows everything there is to know about hydrogen, and another guy that knows everything there is to know about oxygen, but you put them together, and the two of them couldn't tell you a thing about water or the behavior of water, right? Because water is a new whole. Yes, there's hydrogen and there's oxygen parts, but they form a new whole that has emergent properties that behave totally unpredictably from what you might guess if you only knew about hydrogen or oxygen alone, right? So nature functions in wholes. So landscapes are the same way. And these brittle landscapes, the drier landscapes of the world, not just the deserts, but also savannas tend to be on the drier side. So it's not in deep, dark jungle, which are more humid, rainforest-type landscapes, but these drier landscapes, which are most of the Earth's surface, in actual fact. These landscapes evolved with grasses, with scattered trees, and with a particular set of animals being large herbivores that run in massive herds. Now, the behavior of those animals is really what drives these ecosystems. And because they evolved over at least 30 million years or more since kind of grasses came on the scene, those behaviors are important to how those wholes function. And they were the way that those herbivores ran around the landscape was dependent on predators being in the system. Because predators made those animals move constantly, as well as stay tightly bunched up in fairly dense herds. And that had a particular type of impact on the landscape, to where it might look like it was destroyed once they moved across it. If you've got a herd of 50 million buffalo, it takes 2 days to get across a little valley. That valley is going to look pretty destroyed by the time they get across. But the thing was, those animals did not come back until all of those plants had fully recovered. And that stimulation of those plants by those animals was vital. It's co-evolved into those relationships. There are some grasses that will respond with new growth just from the enzymes in the saliva of the cattle.
All right.
Right? So they've co-evolved relationships for a very long period of time, and they function as wholes. But we've lost the predators out of most of these systems. We no longer have that behavior. The standard ranching practice is just a kind of, it's called set stocking. So you just set the animals out on the land. They have access to every plant they want all year long on the whole property. That's kind of the standard practice. And that's exactly the opposite behavior of what we see in natural ecosystems with functional wholes where the predators are still involved in the system. This is something Alan Savory recognized in one of the key insights in holistic management. So that's what we're mimicking. Hopefully it wasn't too long a way around to that, but that is what we can mimic with electric fence, is we're, in essence, creating that behavior in our herds that we would have seen with the bison or with the massive herds of wildebeest and zebras and kudu and impalas in the Serengeti. And that's what built the deepest, richest soils in the world. It was that type of behavior. So, in our Midwest, right, our primary agricultural belt, those soils were built, by that type of behavior, by the bison and by megafauna. We lost all the megafauna out of our landscapes 10,000 years ago, or 74% of those.
I can see that the electric fence can work on a smaller farm, but can you apply that to like big farms, or if your animals are left on just basically wild land, how do you make it work?
Well, and you absolutely can do this at pretty much any scale. So I mean, I have clients with a couple 100,000 acres. I've clients with 50,000 and clients with 200 acres. But and we can do this on all of these places. So it's a matter of getting the fencing infrastructure built, which is a lot less expensive to do these days and a lot more minimal with this electric fence situation. So one method we often use, we'll create sort of corridors across the landscape that are narrow enough that one person with a temporary electric fence can just string a wire. If we're just using cattle, all you need is even one wire. They'll respect that. String a wire between one fence and the other. Maybe it's a quarter mile, maybe it's 800 feet. It just depends on the landscape and what makes sense there. And so you need that fencing in place, and you need water for the animals in place. So a way to pipe water around to where they need it and that kind of a thing. And we see the plants respond tremendously when they have the right recovery time after being grazed. And so you can, ranchers can begin to use more and more animals because they're growing more and more forage, which also leads to a better economic bottom line. But it's also creating soil in the process and diversifying their grass species. So a lot of these guys will see new perennial grass plants coming out of the seed bank that they haven't seen in 40 years or in a very long time, when they change the management, change the behavior of these animals. It positively affects. I mean, some of these guys are doing this at animal densities of 1 million pounds of beef to the acre. But the critical point is the amount of time those animals spend, not how many animals there are. So where range science has had it pretty much backwards, the whole time, is range science has always been focused on, well, there's too many animals out there, and that's why you're overgrazing. Not at all. Overgrazing is a function of the time that the animals are exposed to the plants and the amount of recovery time those plants have before they get re-exposed to the animals.
In essence, then, your electric fence has taken the place, the zap of the electric fence has taken the place of the bite of the predators by keeping the herds moving around in tight bunches from place to place to place.
That is exactly right. It's just mimicking what, the behavior that the predators would have created in the past if they were there. If you are on a very large landscape, another way that this can be done is just old-fashioned herding. So you can, herd the animals and keep them moving around a landscape and fairly tightly bunched, just by using humans as herders to do this. And of course, all of these can be done with cattle. They can be done with sheep, goats, pigs, you name it, or all of them together in a single herd, or just sheep and cattle in a herd. We call a flerd. or right. So there's a lot of different ways that this can be approached. It's very adaptable and flexible, and that's one of the most important things I think we're going to need for this new agriculture or new approaches to it going forward. Is to have that adaptability, flexibility that's going to allow us to respond to the shocks and stresses and disturbances that are going to be unpredictable and that are coming in all domains, in ecological domain, financial domain, social domain, and that are going to impact farms and ranches globally.
I recently saw a video from a chef. His name is Dan Barber, and he has a very, very interesting, one of those new old ways of looking at food, in the sense that basically that's the way it used to be done traditionally for millenniums. It's basically you eat the food that is able to grow locally. So you create a local cuisine based on what's available locally instead of having to import food from South America or this and that to make it, like fancy food. He's saying that, for example, a very good example that he gave us is that the Southern cuisine is very adapted to what's available locally, while on the other hand, some of the Nouvelle Cuisine and all this highfalutin type of cuisine, they pick and choose only what they want out of different sources, but they don't necessarily support the local agriculture per se, or what is available locally. What do you think about this?
I think it is important for sure to support kind of local farmers and ranchers, to do what they're doing. It sort of keeps, it's just sensible because we're eating, it's connecting us to our local landscapes in a much more direct way when we can do that. And like we've talked about, that food is our most basic connection to our landscapes. And so if we connect to the ones we actually live in, that's, I think, just makes us stronger. I don't think there's no case where you should eat any food that's not within 100 miles or whatever. There are folks out there that will claim that. I think there is value to bringing in some other foods from some other regions, if only because it creates a more resilient overall food system. And having trade between regions has always been the human condition. Now that can get very extreme in our sort of globalized world today, but in other words, all I'm saying is if you sourced everything 100% all the time, everybody did, from just their local region, and then you have a major drought, now what do you do?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because so you need some relationships and some trade, and that, I think that's totally acceptable. But I think as a general approach, connecting as much as you can to your local area, for most of your food staples and everything, it's a great idea.
There's another issue related to that, is that people have lost the habit of eating what is grown not only locally but also seasonally. For example, one expects to have strawberries all year long, and it's like, why import strawberries from Latin America? And why can't you wait a few months until the strawberry season is back on again and be all, and support your local agricultures as well? So there's this concept of international, importing food from all different countries that impacts also how much energy is used and how much we, displays to local agriculture. Because when you import pineapples, or you import strawberries from whatever, Chile, or grapes or so on, you're basically also hurting the local economy by doing that.
Right. You're sending your money outside of your local economy. Now, that is another huge value of local food systems. And I don't know if I remember the statistic precisely, but it's somewhere around, every dollar you keep in your local economy produces another $7 to $9 of economic activity in your local region, something like this. And so you're actually creating jobs, or at least the opportunity for more employment, and all those kinds of things by being responsible about a local economy. And there's a lot of pretty cool work being done, things like slow money. Of course, there's a slow food movement, but slow money is kind of the localized economy version of that. It's like investing as if soil mattered, as if ecosystem services, nature's benefits to humans actually mattered. That's kind of their general approach.
Yeah, I am aware of the slow money movement, which is basically a way to invest and support local agriculture or food-related business, not just agriculture, and basically loan them the money, which typically nowadays bank will not loan money to small businesses because they are too risky. And you get a little bit of return of it, nothing to brag about, but 5% is just not that bad. And yet there's also another kind of return you get from doing that is you're supporting your local farmers, your local producers, and there's an interaction. Your money is used locally to help your local community. There's a emotional benefit to that too. You're doing good instead of spending or wasting your money or whatever, or investing your money in international corporation that couldn't care less a bit about what you do.
It's so true, and it kind of comes back in a way to that different forms of capital that we were talking about. It's like, yes, you get a financial capital return, but you have so many other capitals that are returning to your local area as well. And how much is that? I mean, that's real, tangible life stuff. It makes your life measurably better in many ways, and your local area, your local ecology. Even so, if you're supporting some of these perennial polycultures out there and creating more savanna-based food-producing, ecosystem service-producing landscapes, that's actually far more valuable than a landscape that's only producing food. And in fact, it is actually the ecosystem services, so to speak, which just means things like, clean air, clean water. When water filters through healthy soils, it cleans it. The air gets cleaned by a diversity of plants. The soil gets built, carbon gets stored. All of these are things that benefit humans very directly, and they call them ecosystem services or nature's benefits. All those things are actually 12 to 16 times more economically valuable than just the produce that comes out of agriculture. So if we can create and design and maintain and manage systems that are giving us more and more of that stuff that's going to lead to health of our whole local area and ourselves, that's way more valuable than just creating simply a financial product.
Where can we find more information about what you do, your work, and so on?
Anybody who's interested at all in growing some of their own food, I would highly recommend you look into permaculture. There's books. A good place to start is just called Introduction to Permaculture by Bill Mollison. But there's many books out there. So producing some of our own food can be part of that equation, and anybody can do this, even if all you have is a balcony in a high-rise. You could be producing food. And anyhow, so that's a good place to start. If, looking into holistic management is also highly recommended. So if you'd like to find out a bit more about me or the things that I'm up to, just go ahead and type my name into any search engine, Owen Hablutzel, OwenHablutzel. So I just kind of think of that as my distributed website that I don't have to pay for. Okay, if you're also interested in having me come and speak at an event or do a workshop, or maybe you're a farmer or rancher who wants to just talk more about how we might be able to collaborate with your operation, feel free to get in touch with me. Go to owen@gmail.com, GO2OWEN @gmail. I'd love to hear from you.
Cool. Thank you for that. And thank you again, Owen, for being on the Low Carb Paleo show. And as we say in Texas, à votre santé, y'all.
Thanks so much for having me, Alain and Mark. It's been wonderful.
Yeah, thanks again.
Absolutely.